I'm Rob Port from SayAnythingBlog.com. I've got on the line with me Kevin Cramer, Representative-elect Kevin Cramer. He beat out Pam Gulleson on the statewide ballot earlier this month and is in the next Congress going to be representing North Dakota in the House of Representatives. Kevin, thanks for your time.
Hey, thanks for the opportunity, Rob. You bet.
I wanted to. I was kind of asking some of my friends and readers what I should ask you about this interview. What sort of questions they might be interested in hearing the answers to. And one of them said something I thought was kind of interesting. It said, "I don't think I could ask him anything that I couldn't predict his answer to." Sort of speaks to his consistency of beliefs, and I mean that to be a compliment. Is that something that you pride yourself on? Is your consistency?
Well, first of all, I very much appreciate it because I do take it as a compliment, and I don't know that I'd say I pride myself on it, but I work very hard at it, Rob. One of the traps in politics, and I've seen many public servants fall into this trap, is the trap of finding out what the public believes about something and then taking that position. And what's interesting is the House of Representatives, oddly, as a matter of sort of history, was built that way. It's the people's house. It's the house where the politicians up for election all the time, so they're always accountable to the people. And it's legislative districts, not states. Although in our case, it's the same thing. The congressional district is the state. And so there's a tendency in the House, if you will, to sort of represent the view of the people. At the same time, I maintain that in a free society and in a democratic society, it's the job of the politician or the would-be public servant to express in clear, transparent fashion what it is you believe, and then the people decide if that's what they want or not. And I've tried to do more of the latter than the former. Now, having said that, occasionally I've noticed that I've been wrong or that I've learned something from the public that I didn't know before. And so I think you have to have the right balance, of rock solid principles, bedrock principles that you base your decisions and your beliefs on, but at the same time, be open to the possibility that somebody else might have a better idea.
That kind of segues into my next question. One thing that we hear a lot from, in the media and in a lot of the public discussion is that we've got too much gridlock in Washington, too much partisanship. We need more compromise and more reaching across the aisle. And one thing that because obviously, compromises shouldn't be a dirty word. But on the flip side of thing, how do you compromise? Because compromise can also be a negative thing. If we're talking about, say, compromising your principles, that's not a positive thing. So how do you do the positive sort of compromise without, in effect, compromising your principles, which would be the negative connotation of the word?
Yeah. Well, sometimes it's a matter of degrees, I suppose. But I think it's a very big challenge. But what I find interesting about it, Rob, is that while Americans don't want gridlock, they keep electing it. How do you explain a Republican majority in the House of Representatives and yet a Democrat majority in the Senate in an election year when there were plenty of opportunities for voters to vote one or the other? In our own state, they had the opportunity to vote one or the other, and they chose both. And so what is the signal that sends? I think one of the possibilities is that we've got to consider the possibility that people prefer a good, robust checks and balance to a fast track or a fast train toward some progressive agenda or some other agenda. And so to some degree, the voters are the ones that have chosen this, quote, gridlock. I do think there are things people want to see happen, and they want to see us work together. And so when it comes to compromise, and I think the fiscal cliff represents perhaps one of the greatest symbols of it. And we have on the one hand expiring tax cuts. We have on the other hand a $16 trillion debt that's the result of overspending, not lack of revenue. And at the same time, we have a very fragile economy. And so how you fix one thing could have a very detrimental effect on the other, such as tax rate increases, which might on the surface, if you believe in sort of a linear economic relationship, could create revenue to help fix the budget deficit. On the other hand, of course, it could be the thing that absolutely devastates the economy. I think it takes a balanced approach into that with some of those principles. But I do think I do think people are looking for us to work more closely together, and there are some things that you just can't compromise on. And I think you have to go in, though, Rob, knowing in advance, at least to some degree. If you don't know what you're willing to compromise on, certainly you ought to know what you're not willing to compromise, and that's the critical thing.
I want to get into the fiscal cliff and your thoughts on what may be left of that situation once you get into Congress after what they call the lame duck session. But getting back to the idea of gridlock on the North Dakota ballot, we had a candidate in Heidi Heitkamp who while certainly campaigning as almost right of center in a lot of ways,
sure.
I think what we're going to see is quite liberal in practice in how she actually governs. And on the other side of the ballot, we have you, who was I guess I think is viewed as a very conservative elected official. I think you were viewed as being very conservative as a public service commissioner, and I think that you were viewed as a very conservative candidate for the U.S. House. How do you explain that voters would vote for someone like you on one hand and Heidi Heitkamp on the other, while simultaneously, I think when you're looking at public opinion polls, you're looking at the media, expressing a preference for, quote unquote, middle of the road and compromise and working together. How do you explain those three, very almost seemingly disparate choices?
Well, it is interesting, and in fact, it was the first question that was asked me when I got to Washington last week. I got out of the car, stepped on the curb to go into the hotel, and a Fox News reporter grabbed me, and a political reporter, and that was the first question they had for me, because they'd been watching this North Dakota situation. And I think there's a number of things. First of all, I think we are also personalities. We are individuals and people, not just politicians that sort of carry a flag with either a donkey or an elephant on it. And so personalities matter. There's a certain reward for work that you've done. There's a comfort level with a person that you may agree or disagree with. But all are factors that go into voting. It's not just simply pure philosophy or pure party affiliation. And I think in a state like North Dakota, that's even more true because, of course, I don't know what were the 315,000 or so votes cast. That's not very many people that determine, who a United States senator is going to be. And so while it's a common number for a House member, it's not for a senator. I think you have to consider that people got to know the two Senate candidates very, very well, or at least they perceived they knew them very well, because of the volume of money and ads and public appearances and all that. So I think it's a combination of factors. But I think one of them, even a funnier, if you will, or a more odd comparison isn't even between the Senate race and the House race so much as it is between the president's race and the Senate race. Because in my mind, there was a more common theme there. I mean, you had in the Romney situation, this very wealthy, successful entrepreneur business guy versus the community organizer and an incumbent community organizer at that. So I suspect that in the case of Barack Obama, a lot of it was a retraction of people's vote from last time. And to me, that was almost more of a comparison to the Berg-Heitkamp race than my race with Pam Gulleson.
I want to ask you now about the fiscal cliff, and obviously there's a lot of uncertainty here, probably even for you,
Yes.
seeing as how you don't have a vote in Congress right now, and Congress is addressing this issue right now. But what do you expect? I mean, what sort of a deal are you expecting to come at the end of this Congress, and what sort of issues are you going to have to tackle with this in the Congress that you're going to be serving in?
Well, what I suspect is that the current Congress is going to kick the can down the road. That is to say that they will probably come up with some compromises and some policies that will delay the fiscal cliff, and that any long-term action will be later next year. But that's what I expect to have happen. How they'll do that, I don't know. You always see some the experts on whether there really is a fiscal cliff, how detrimental will it really be. So I expect that I think you're gonna see a short-term fix with hope that the next Congress will deal with it in the long term. And I think that's hoping for an awful lot because, if time was the issue, why didn't they deal with this a year ago? why do we always have to kick the can down the road? I mean, why haven't we had a budget for 3 years plus in the Senate? Why we can't continue this practice of always kicking the can down the road for another 100 days or another 6 months? So I'm afraid that's what's going to happen. But I do sense a much greater call for comprehensive tax reform. And I hear our speaker talking about it a lot more. And of course, he's talking about it in the context of tax rate increases, or, you know, in terms of revenue. How do we generate more revenue? Do we do it through tax rate increases, or do we do it through comprehensive tax reform? Of course, I prefer the latter, as does he, and I think that's where the real showdown is going to come on tax policy. But I think we'll be dealing with it in the next Congress.
When you say comprehensive tax reform, what does that mean specifically?
I think, to me, that means looking at the entire code. We want to talk about tax fairness. I think we should talk about tax fairness, but I don't automatically assume that tax fairness means that the richest 2% ought to pay a lot more. I don't think our economy can weather that type of a storm right now. To me, comprehensive tax reform is look at the entire code, a flattening of it. I've always been, quite clear that I support a much flatter tax code that neither punishes success nor rewards sloth. I think everybody, if we're going to talk about fairness, then everybody ought to pay their fair share, not just rich people pay a lot more than their fair share to somehow balance it out. I don't think that's not what America is based on. That's certainly not how a free market economy works. So, I just think a flatter tax code with fewer loopholes and deductions. I like to talk that talk. I think Republicans ought to talk more about tax fairness and what it means to us, rather than let Democrats always have that mantra of fair share. So fair share means rich people are supposed to pay more than everybody else as a percentage of their income.
Real quick, last question. I wanted to ask you, what's it like? Because obviously it's experience 99.9% of Americans are never going to go through. What's it like being a newly elected member and going to Congress and going through the orientation and I guess being in these buildings that some of the greatest leaders in America were in, and almost from a lot of the media reports that we're reading, and I read one that was kind of funny where you talked about wondering, somebody quoted you as saying that you were wondering if anybody was ever going to get any sleep. And is it a little bit like moving in day in college where everybody's kind of moving into their new dorms and things like that? Describe a little bit that experience for us.
That's a good illustration. It's a little bit like moving into your dorm on the first day of college, except that on top of that, you have a $16 trillion debt problem facing you, and you kind of go, oh my gosh, what have I got myself into? It's actually a very, very high level drinking from a fire hose. Because there instantly there are briefings on technology, what you can do, what you can't do. They give you all these passwords and codes and things to get into the system, and they give you just tons and tons of information. And at the same time, Rob, here's what struck me and continues to, because I go back again next week, is you have a lot of the responsibilities of a member of Congress, even though you aren't one yet. I've already voted on several resolutions, including one on earmarks, things that apply to the rules of the Congress. I've voted for leadership already, all those things, and all these other responsibilities, and yet you don't have any staff. You don't have any resources at your disposal. Whatever you do spend, you have to. It's your personal income or your campaign income, and so the transition is all on the member, not on Congress. And that's fine. That's as it should be. I have no problem with that. But it could be a bit overwhelming if you weren't able to sort of prioritize. And I'm pretty good at prioritizing things, not just in terms of what has to be done, but sort of in your own mind, what you have to think about. Otherwise, you could become anxious very quickly if you didn't have a good, strong mental state. You could panic. So yeah, it's really quite overwhelming. And at the same time, it's quite exciting because on top of everything you have to learn, there are other things you want to learn. I want to you lobby for a good committee, for example. The leadership has said there will be no freshmen on the A committees, on the exclusive committees like Ways and Means and Energy and Commerce and Finance and Banking, and yet last Congress there were lots of freshmen on them because there were so many freshmen,
including Rick Berg from North Dakota, who made it to Ways and Means.
Exactly, and so that means that there are a lot more senior members that didn't get on them. So you're dealing with all of that as well, because they're going to be voting on some of the committee assignments next week. you have the leadership votes, and the top 3 leaders, of course, ran unopposed. But there are several others in the conference that were not unopposed, and so you have to take the time to get to know the people running. And so there's just a lot to do, a lot to think about. But you know what? I think it's just a microcosm of what's to come. It's a very fast pace. It's a pressure cooker, and I think that the ones that survive it the best are able to prioritize those things that matter. I think, Rob, it gets back sort of to the first point we talked about. I think that's why it's so helpful, not just as a practical matter, to have a set of bedrock principles on which you stand and by which you measure everything. And so that's why the Constitution, if you're a constitutionalist, if you believe in the Constitution, the values of the Constitution, you have a measuring stick that should help you make better decisions easier in the future. As I always say, I put everything in the context of a $16 trillion debt. If you do that, it's easier to say no to certain things. If you have some bedrock principles you stand on, really other decisions are so much easier, and you have a much easier time communicating with people.
Kevin, thank you so much for your time, and looking forward to talking to you as time goes on, and staying in touch and keeping everybody back here in North Dakota informed.
Well, Rob, as you know, that's my mantra. All else aside, I like to be transparent. I like to be available and accountable, and you will help me do that. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, I appreciate your time. Thank you.
You bet. Bye-bye.